Good day, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of our Code Red series. My name is Gail Rutkowski, and I'm an Executive Director of NASSTRAC. Today's webinar is a bit of a departure from our regular webinar progression. Normally, we conclude a series by recapping the information and offering solutions and suggestions to our listeners. Given the urgency of today's environment, the demand we received for a more immediate turnaround was apparent. So today, we're bringing back our previous panelists who will share with us a deeper dive into the information they shared last time, along with their suggestions and possible strategies to help you navigate these tumultuous times. I'd like to introduce Mike Regan of TranzAct Technologies and NASSTRAC's Advocacy Chair, who will moderate today's discussion. Mike?
Thank you so much, Gail. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this Code Red series. And something unusual happened here. And that is after our first webinar, some people got back to us and they said, you know, congratulations, Mike, you've managed to scare the bejeebies out of us. But, you know, what we need to know isn't just the conditions, is what can we do about it? So they said, if you're going to do a webinar, what we'd really like to know is a perspective from the carrier and also, you know, how long this is going to go on. Add it all up together. How can we plan and what can we do to effectively address the Code Red conditions? I'm delighted that we've got some great resources that were with us the first time, and I want to personally thank them for taking time out of the busy schedules to share with you some insights about what you can do. We've got Avery Vise, who is the VP of Trucking from FTR. I've followed Avery's work for a long time, and he's spot on, one of the best, if not the best, forecasters for things that are happening in the trucking industry. Eric Fuller is the president and CEO of US Xpress, large truckload carrier. Geoff Muessig is a friend of ours, and he is the chief marketing officer as well as executive vice president for Pitt, Ohio, which is a great regional carrier. And then our friend Jerry Hempstead. It wouldn't be a webinar on trucking and stuff like that if we didn't have Jerry along. Jerry is a 40-year veteran and a parcel expert and the president of Hempstead Consulting. Now, very briefly, if you missed our last Code Red, I'm not going to take a lot of time. These slides are available if you simply ask for them. But one of the things we highlighted in the last webcast was that volatility is the story. And one of the reasons it is the story is because we are seeing dramatic increases in things like e-commerce sales, which has resulted in all sorts of unusual behavior patterns from FedEx and UPS and the regional parcel carriers. Folks, their networks are full. The other thing that we are seeing are what we call COVID-induced uncertainty in corporate supply chains, the bullwhip effect. I just saw this week, for example, that the toilet paper and paper towels are once again going to be rationed. One of the things that we saw as well was that the shippers are experiencing, you know, what Geoff brought out in our last webcast that I thought was interesting is instead of a 2-3 year or biannual business cycle, we're seeing business cycles occur over a 5-month period. Avery touched on the fact that in March or April or May, if you were going to market, you were getting fantastic deals and rates from the carriers because they were wondering, will the demand ever recover? Well, it has in spades. And that's why one of the things that we are seeing are these capacity constraints across the board. LTL carriers doing things like freight embargoes or surcharges on what we call non-traditional freight, such as, you know, over-dimensional 12-foot stuff, or, you know, the issue of minimum charge shipments. We're seeing climatic events, fires and hurricanes. Railroads are even getting in on. Ocean is a mess. The absence of surge capacity is creating a very challenging holiday season. And I just saw the report in the supply chain newsletter that we're seeing issues with packaging and cardboard material. So one of the things that we talked about was that if you remain a status quo shipper in this kind of environment, you should expect to see your truckload rates go up by at least 10 to 12%. Now, one of the reasons we have this webcast today is because you have a choice. You can either choose to be a strategic shipper or maintain that status quo. And some of the things that we're looking at here that Geoff will touch on and Eric will touch on as well in the truckload sector is the impact, for example, of driver pay. Eric highlighted the fact that the carriers would be increasing driver pay by as much as 20%. I had somebody send me an email and say, come on, do you really think it's 20%? I sent him back a notice that came out that day about Heartland increasing their driver pay by 12% and acknowledging that they're probably going to have to do exactly what Eric said and look at this in tranches to get the driver pay up there. On the LTL, we basically said there were 5 key attributes used in scoring shippers and establishing LTL rates. And Geoff highlighted, how these impact shippers, and we're going to be talking today about strategies that you can use in that area. And Jerry, I don't even know where you go with the heavy handling. One of the things, I got a distress email from one of the people that attended the Code Red webcast and said, look, UPS is changing the girth. I said, girth? Yeah. It's going to 105 inches and they're imposing a $16 surcharge for packages with a girth. Of course, Jerry will remind you, as I'm sure he will, everything is negotiable. That's the Jerry Hempstead rule. Wherever I go, I invoke the Jerry Hempstead, everything is negotiable. So that leaves us basically intermodal, expect 8 to 10% increases. Huge issues in the ocean market. Our next Code Red webinar that Gail will be highlighting will be featuring some issues with ocean, finding tremendous issues with containers. The Chinese are trying to glom on to as many containers as possible for high value exports. Air markets are all over the place. And that leads us to the what can we do to handle the marketplace volatility. Now, one of the things that we highlighted there is to understand what you're going to hear today are options and choices you can choose to make. However, it's like a parachute. It don't work unless you open it or unless you deploy it. The second thing that we have is we, in this environment especially, it amazes me that very few companies, less than 10% of the shippers, we think actually have a written transportation plan that defines choices or resources. So what we're going to go back and do, if I can go back to that slide, we're going to pause this for a moment here and just basically say, become a shipper of choice. And this is, we've got suggestions for collaborating with carriers and things like that. But for right now, what I'd like to do is answer a question that some of you asked us to address after the first webcast. How long will this continue? Is this like a 2013 and 2014, where it occurred in the fourth quarter of 2013 and then on into the first quarter of 2014 and things stabilized? Or will it continue on throughout 2021? To address that, we've asked our friend Avery Vise to help you address for budget purposes, and feel free to share this with your C-level executives. Some of you wrote back and said this was great because we shared it with the C-level executives to help them understand it's not us, it's entire across the North American spectrum of supply chains. So Avery, help us understand, when will this get better, and what should we expect to see in 2021?
Sure. Okay, let me get this in slideshow mode real quick.
And while Avery's doing this, we will make all these slides once again available to you if you simply ask.
Okay, everyone should be able to see the slideshow real quick. Just before I launch into this, I am going to keep my section of it as brief as possible, because my role here probably is to tell you how long you're going to be dealing with the problem, and Eric and Geoff and Jerry are going to be the ones focusing on how to deal with that problem. We aren't really management consultants at FTR. We're analysts, forecasters. We certainly have to understand the market dynamics, but it's not really our function to tell people how to do the job, because people who are practitioners in logistics know more about that than we do. We really look at the numbers and the dynamics, and that's really our function. Just real quick, this is not news to anyone. In fact, Mike has already covered it to some extent. We're not seeing a surge anymore in the spot market, but we're not seeing any relief. We're essentially leveling off at very high levels in the dry van side. No sign at all of any real relief there yet. In refrigerated, of course, we would not expect to see any for another week or two, any relief there anyway, because of seasonality. We've set 2 consecutive records in volume for refrigerated in the spot market, or in the truckstop.com system at least. We've set 3 consecutive records in the market demand index for refrigerated. So refrigerated is the one that is still surging. Of course, we would expect that to continue anyway, again, for another couple of weeks. And then even flatbed, which is certainly not the strongest. Flatbed is a much more complex situation, and we'll talk about that in a second. We have a lot of strength on residential construction side, but then the other two really big areas are still sort of mixed. You know, we still have a industrial sector that has not fully recovered, and we have an energy sector that also is not doing as well as it was before the pandemic. So, you know, a lot of the strength we're seeing here in terms of loads has to do just with disruption and also, you know, with the residential construction side or construction in general. So moving on, I'm going to show a couple of things that we got data for just this morning. So this is probably news to you unless you, you know, unless you've already read, you know, a lot of the economics websites. So this morning, we learned that retail sales were up 0.3% month over month. That is not a strong, that even in a normal economy, that's not a particularly strong increase. It is by far the smallest increase we've seen since the contraction. I guess it's about half of what we saw in August. But something to the point that Mike made earlier about e-commerce, if it were not for non-store retail, this would have been a negative number. We had significant contractions in the areas that were strengths in September: clothing, department stores, sporting goods. Those were down 4%. Nothing other than non-store retail was up by any more than 1.2%. 1.2% electronics and appliance stores were up 1.2%. But non-store retail was up 3.2%. And you take non-store retail out, this is a negative number month over month. And, you know, part of that is just sort of the ongoing strength of e-commerce in the economy since the pandemic. It's also, there are some distortions here. One is, and perhaps the biggest distortion of all, is that Amazon's Prime Day was in October this year. It is normally I believe, in July. So you have, and that affects this in two ways. Number one, it affects the raw amount of sales that are non-store retail. It also affects the seasonal adjustments because you do not expect that in October. So seasonal adjustments, you can't do without them because you can't compare non-adjusted numbers from February with non-adjusted numbers from October. But you do have to recognize that when we're looking at a lot of these numbers, you know, it's going to throw it off a little. Bottom line is, it's still a pretty strong environment. And we're still 5% ahead of February. You know, we're still seeing good strength there. Industrial production is not so much. Now, we did get a good number this morning, up 1.1%. That's pretty strong. But if you look at the graph of that, it doesn't look all that impressive. Now, you know, the graph is focusing on a relatively narrow y-axis, but still, if you look at where we are relative to February, we're down 5.6%. And again, I'll go back to retail and food service sales. We're up 5% there. We're down, you know, upwards of 6% in industrial production. And when we look at the, you know, what that is doing in the marketplace, I'm going to focus first on inventories, and then we'll talk about just our outlook. We've had some revised figures. This also came out this morning. For the last 2 months, we are at record lows in the ratio of inventories to sales. Those were adjusted downward from, you know, what was essentially not materially any different from 1.23 to 1.22. But we can say this is the all-time leanest environment that we've been in. You know, when we look at October, it's going to come up a little because 0.3% increase in retail sales. I can almost guarantee that we're going to have inventories higher than that because imports are strong still and production is stronger. So it will come up, probably will not be materially different. Wholesale also is pretty lean. Certainly in the post-trade war environment, you know, it's the leanest it's been since before the expectation of tariffs at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. But also look at the blue line, manufacturing. Even after 6 months, 7 months of this, we still are not in a normal environment manufacturing. Our manufacturing inventories are still slightly inflated relative to sales. So when we look at the outlook, and this is from our trucking update product. This is updated from what I showed in the last webinar, because this is based on our November report. It is not reflecting what is being experienced by those dry van carriers that are involved primarily in consumer goods, and it's not reflecting what intermodal carriers are seeing. It is reflecting what the entire Class 8 truck market is seeing, and it is that we're improving, but we're not back to where we were in a total Class 8 truck freight basis, and we probably will not be until the middle of next year. And we do expect a little bit of a pause, as we get through the holiday season. A lot of this, extra strength that we're seeing because of the extraordinarily lean retail environment or retail inventory environment is going to correct a little bit before we start seeing a much more broad-based recovery. Now the bars are year over year, and of course, if you look at April, May, those are very large year over year gains, but those are sort of artificial because essentially there was no U.S. economy in April. But there are going to be strong, gains throughout the year. We're looking at, the entire Class A market being up 5.2% next year, which is a strong figure, historical basis. And we expect in 2022 for that to continue even beyond that, not quite at that level, but certainly still what we would consider to be a pretty strong recovery ahead. Utilization, again, this does not reflect, a specific segment of the market. Yes, there is, incredible pressure in the van markets, dry van and refrigerated. But, if you look at what's happening in industrial, and industrial is a huge part of the total, we're not at 2018 levels. We're not expecting actually to ever get to 2018 levels in this cycle, but this cycle we expect to be continually stronger all the way through 2022. So it is going to be.
Did you say 2022?
2022, yes, that is our current forecast.
So just to use point of reference, Avery, I don't mean to interrupt, but point of reference, that would imply that in terms of the teeter-totter between shipper carrier positions in the marketplace, that the carriers will have an upper hand in negotiations through 2022. Is that correct?
That would be, yes. I mean, I think here's how I would look at this chart. I mean, again, this chart only goes through 2021. We're not going to give you everything for free, but I will say that that line does continue to hold pretty well, but it never gets to where we were in late 17 and 18. So we're not going to have the intensity that we had in 17, 18, but I think we're going to have a longevity that is greater. Also, I think our current forecast is there is going to potentially be a little bit of a pause here. And here's where I will throw in sort of my insights here as to how shippers might approach this is, one reaction that you might see in the shipping community to the pause that we expect in Q1 is to say, aha, that was all, that's all behind us. There was a short-term thing and it's now gone, and now we're going to get aggressive. And you can't blame shippers for trying. What we think is more, going to be a more successful approach for shippers to take is to say, aha, things are a little softer now. I don't have to necessarily, give everything that the carrier is asking, but I can probably give quite a bit of what the carrier is asking, because it's going to get worse from here. And I'm okay doing that. Now, I'm expecting Eric to contradict me on, I'm not going to give you everything the carrier is asking, but.
Eric would never do that.
but I would suggest that we're not, our forecast is right now, and especially with the, the good news that we've seen. I mean, there's a near-term long-term issue. We're seeing COVID cases surge beyond, I think, what we ever expected them to happen. At the same time, we're having news about vaccines that's more favorable and perhaps even more near term than we were expecting.
Right.
So I think it's quite plausible that we will be looking at, a next quarter or even 2 quarters that are not very strong, but then after that, even stronger than what we're showing here. So, that's kind of the environment we have. And in rates, again, we're seeing that, kind of, around 10% increase year over year for next year in total rates. It obviously is going to vary a little, but, that's kind of what we're seeing. I want to end with this because I think this is a potential X factor. It is an X factor in terms of how strong things are going to be, who's going to be the winners and losers. This is a chart of new carrier authority granted to trucking companies on a monthly basis going back to 2006. And, it has grown over time. And you see 2018, that peak there is August of 2018. Then you get to the last 4 months, July, August, September, October. And it has been an extraordinary surge. We could do a whole webinar on why, and we don't have, I've already used up probably more time than I should have, but, we had a couple of things going on. We have digital freight matching technology maturing. We have a lot of players in the marketplace pushing it. We have legal issues, especially in California, that are discouraging use of the leased owner operator model. But I think by and large, we have a spot market that has just gone, nuts. And so you add all that together and we're seeing these unprecedented increases in the number of small carriers. And again, that last bar is October. I have the ability to look at preliminary data on a daily basis. And November, if it comes in shorter than October, will only be because there's 2 fewer work days in November than there are in October. It doesn't seem to be letting up. And what that does to the marketplace, we do know that a lot of these will go out of business. They always do. The other thing that happened yesterday is we got the first major increase in diesel prices that we've had in really a year. And if that is the beginning of a trend, that's going to put a lot of pressure on these guys. But this is new. This isn't necessarily new capacity. A lot of these are probably leased owner operators,
right? Okay.
Who are moving over. But it's an interesting dynamic.
So Avery, let me just see if I have this summarized, and then Eric, I'm going to ask you to pick it up. So this is great, Avery. What you're saying is, at least for the foreseeable future, reasonably strong freight demand through 2021, possibly on into 2022. The second takeaway that I got was that you may see a dip in the first quarter, although I think one of the things that's going to be really challenging, and perhaps Geoff and Jerry can attest this, is with the release of the vaccine, how that's going to impact capacity, at least on a temporary basis when that hits. But if that does not whack it completely, then you're going to see perhaps a dip in the first quarter, but don't get your hopes up because that's going to go back into the carrier favor for the remainder of 2021. Accurate assessment?
Yes.
Perfect. Eric, I'm sitting out there as a shipper. Jerry has just, or rather Avery has just helped me understand why my truckload budget, you laughed when I said truckload rates will go up by 5 to 7%. You said 10 to 12%. And Avery is confirming that here, for budget purposes. But I'm a shipper that doesn't want to pay 10%. I want to pay less because my budget, if it goes 10%, I might have to attend a webinar on resume writing. But help me understand what I'm going to have to do in order to work with you to get the best possible rates and reasonable capacity within the constraints that I'm experiencing.
Yeah, I think in the near term, it's going to be difficult. You think about on the truckload on the carrier side, you've really gone through 2 bid cycles of flat to downward rates. You have insurance costs that have boomed over the last 12 months. You have other inflationary issues from a cost perspective with equipment and things like that. And now you've got driver pay increases that have gone into effect. And really one round of it, I think there's another round of it to come. So the 10 to 12% is not, it's not necessarily, I wouldn't call it predatory by any means. It's really what the carriers need to kind of make up a lot of this inflation and a lot of the additional costs that they've seen in the last, say, 18 to 24 months.
Okay.
And so I think that 10 to 15 is going to be a pretty standard ask. There may be some opportunity from a overall network standpoint if you can get more defined with a carrier where they can identify certain lanes that they want or need in order to fill out their network that may give them some efficiencies, and those efficiencies may allow them to get a little more aggressive from a price perspective. So I think there's some opportunities there. I think the other thing is the more and more carriers today are talking about time and velocity than we ever have before. So if you think about a driver has 11 hours to drive on any given day, and if we don't utilize those hours for driving, we don't get them back. So the more a shipper can do to help us to speed that velocity up and to take advantage of more of that 11 hours, then there's opportunity from a rate perspective there. And I'll give you an example. And I think that part of the problem is pricing is broken in the truckload industry as it sits today. So you think about a load that goes from Atlanta to Chicago, and I have 2 different customers that have that load. Well, today it's point A to point B, and essentially those rates are going to be very similar for 2 like lanes from Atlanta to Chicago. The problem is one load may load the trailer and load the truck within 30 minutes, may have perfect transit time, perfect appointments, and unload the truck in 30 minutes. That's a really a good load that speeds velocity. And then you look at another order, and let's say it takes 2 hours to load the truck. The appointment time we get from the customer is less than optimal. It's got 2 or 3 hours of, say, in transit dwell, and then you've got another appointment. You've got another delivery time that takes 2 to 3 hours to unload that tractor. In current environment, those rates are essentially the same. But the reality is that first load is much more advantageous to the carrier. So what you're going to see in this cycle is carriers are going to prioritize the characteristics of the first load over the second. So carriers are getting a lot more defined about lane level statistics, data, load times, unload times, transit, all that. And we're going to be able then to drill that into who we're going to give commitments to. So this year, it's going to be about if you have the right characteristics, you have the velocity in your freight, you'll get the capacity, and you may even get it at a lower rate or a lower rate relative to a 10% increase if you have really quality freight with high velocity. If you're one of those customers where it takes longer, you're going to be deprioritized. I can just tell you that more and more, and this is happening really just in the last 12 months where carriers are getting the kind of data they need to know who has the better characteristics in their lanes and who doesn't. And even from a lane basis. So we can even say, like, I want to pick up at this DC, not this DC, even within a customer, knowing that this DC has a 30-minute turn time and this DC has a 3-hour turn time. We're going to prioritize that DC. So really, that's going to probably be a lot more of the speak you're going to hear from the carriers. When you get pushback, if you start to push back a little bit on rate, they're going to start to have that conversation. I think at some point, maybe 2022, 2023, 2024, you will start to see a more dynamic pricing model that carriers will want to put this into their pricing and start to address the velocity of the individual lanes and loads into their pricing model and change a little bit of this dynamic of this static point A to point B pricing, because it doesn't work for the carriers and it's going to have to change.
Okay,
and I think that's going to be the big ask going forward.
Let me just back up a second, because this is, you did a great job, and you also should probably briefly touch on the treatment of the driver at your facilities, because you and our friends like Derek Leathers from Warner and others, have these geofencing apps and ask the carrier, the driver, to rate the facility as they leave it. So the second point that I just want to highlight here, Eric, because I got some pushback after the first call from somebody when I told them there's a huge gap there, and that is they don't understand the quality of the data that the carriers have to assess the operating attributes of the freight that's being tendered. Okay, and you're saying, and I just want to confirm, and Geoff, I'm sure you're going to mention this, and Jerry as well, that the carriers now have more data than ever before, and they're using it, I call it, and forgive me for being so blunt, they're using it to weaponize their pricing, to make sure that their pricing reflects the cost incurred to service that account. So that if you have the illustration that you just said, where you have a company that has great freight, 30-minute turns, and is doing a great job, they're going to get priority over somebody that basically doesn't pay any attention to their docks and this type of thing. One final thing though, and this is a big issue that Geoff, I hope you'll address as well. I had a shipper that came to me and said, look, I understand what's going on at my docks, but how can you realistically say that I should be responsible for the conditions at my customers' docks? So I do a great job of loading the freight, which is one half of the equation. I send it to a customer or pick it up from a supplier that does an awful job. So help me, what do I do?
Yeah, so if you look at the data that we have, like I said, this has really just happened in the last 12, 18, 24 months where carriers have got this level of data. But I can tell you what we are collecting today is to the minute data on every single lane and every single shipping location and every single delivery location. So we can then know exactly the behavior characteristics of every one of these locations. We also, as you mentioned, we're asking the drivers to rate every facility. So they're giving us feedback and rating every facility. And so that will go into our commitments and pricing as well. If we have a facility that customer or that drivers don't like for whatever reason, they feel like they're mistreated, there's not available bathrooms, what have you, then the drivers may rate that low, and that will go into our commitment, into our pricing going forward, because drivers are a precious commodity, and we also have to make sure that we're prioritizing their opinions and their, their experience that they're getting at these locations is really important, and something that we've also got to figure into this commitment tracking, into this pricing model. And so that's going to be a big part of it as well.
So just summarizing what I heard you say, that you said velocity is key, time and speed there, velocity is key. The second thing is pay attention to what is happening at your docks, what happens with the truck. Some of the other issues that you have mentioned, treatment of the driver, facilities available to the driver. These are things that could potentially go into what we have called, and we're going to be talking about this in a second, because NASSTRAC has a great program called the Strategic Shipper Program. The euphemism that's been used is the shipper of choice, okay? That if you are in fact a reliable shipper of choice, you will have some flexibility when it comes to rate discussions. True or false?
No, I would agree with that. Yeah, I would agree with that. And Mike, you asked the previous question about how can a shipper affect behavior at a vendor. And unfortunately, hopefully you have some sort of power to affect that, because that is going to be something that's going to be tracked, and that is going to drive commitments and pricing. I mean, it's cost. If you think about that 11 hours, we don't get it back. So if we spend that 11 hours waiting on a load or unloading a load or bad transit times, then as a business, we have to prioritize those loads and lanes that have high velocity. And we are going to be kind of dependent on the customer to try to help us through that process. If you don't have that kind of a power, we are going to take a look at what the velocity of the lane and make decisions accordingly.
Okay, two questions that have come up from an anonymous attendee. Is the pay increase for owner operators for hire drivers, for hire drivers, or for both? Well, the owner operator.
The big increases right now are on the company side.
Okay.
But I think you will see some increases as well on the owner operator side over time.
Second question from the same person is, when Eric says the 10 to 12%, is that based on current inflated rates or rates that were contracted in the second quarter of Q1?
That's bid season rates on contract business.
Great. And then the third question, and by the way, anyone that wants to ask a Q&A, it's available to you on the bottom portion of the screen. And that is, will carriers share the customer rating data with us so we could rectify?
Absolutely. So we're in the process of getting all that information and starting to give it to our customers of that time. And then also even the driver information on rating facilities. I mean, we're not going to do that in a vacuum. We will definitely share that with the customers so that they have that information and give the customers an opportunity to change some of that as well. We're not just going to go, and I think the rest of the industry is not going to just go full capacity without having the opportunity for the shippers to change some of that characteristics.
And for those that are wondering, I'm going to turn it over to Geoff now, because you're going to talk about that. Geoff shared some things with me about, in line with this, and one thing that for the shippers here that are on the call that they may not pay attention to, but coming from my background, Geoff, I was an auditor at Price Waterhouse, and we all know what an auditor is, somebody who walks around and stabs the wounded after the war is over. But we audited motor carriers there, and one of the things that we looked at were operating ratio information. So Geoff, take it away. What can shippers do to work with their LTL carriers to get the best possible rates and capacity in this code red environment?
Well, I think in some ways it mirrors some of what Eric's saying in terms of taking information, using it, and making it actionable. So LTL carriers have developed sophisticated costing models. We understand the amount of space a shipment takes up, the amount of time to load. Essentially, if you want to boil it down, at least as a regional LTL carrier, we took the big cost drivers are time and space in our world. I would say that there are two basic segments of customers: those who seek to buy transactionally and those who seek to buy strategically. And I think carriers today are responding in kind, and they'll either sell transactionally or they'll sell strategically. So in this environment, candidly, a shipper wants to buy strategically and encourage that. I think the first thing is looking at how are you using your transportation management system. More and more carriers are adopting it. And there's one school of thought out there: use it in a transactional way. Optimize every shipment, optimize it to the quarter. Well, what you do when you take that type of an approach to its logical extreme is that you destroy the economy of scale that the carrier enjoys at time of pickup. That's probably the easiest way to get better pricing. Consolidate and provide the carrier with 5-10 shipments per day at pickup, and you've now reduced your pickup cost on each shipment to if it was 10 shipments, to 1/10 of the total pickup cost.
Can I stop you right there though? Because one of our things that's available is we did an interview with Vic Stadahar, who worked for us as the head of our logistics group, and he brought up this point, and I want to make sure everybody that's listening to this understands what you're saying. The cost to go and put a truck into a facility is a reasonably fixed cost,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So so if you give that carrier one minimum charge shipment, that's extremely costly. If you give them 10 minimum charge shipments, you can amortize the cost of coming into that facility across those 10 shipments. Is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And ultimately, if you're using 5 different carriers and you're giving them a minimum charge shipment to each of the 5 carriers, you're going to end up in a situation where your pricing is not sustainable. And in the current environment, those carriers will come back knocking at the door to either your 3PL or to you directly, explaining that I need to take a significant price increase because my pricing was predicated on receiving 5 shipments at time of pickup and I'm receiving 1. So that's a very obvious place to look at this. But I think there's also an opportunity to use the TMS strategically from a consignee standpoint. And this touches a little bit on what Eric referenced in terms of understanding what are the delivery characteristics of the consignee. I think oftentimes shippers perceive that LTL carriers are pretty much the same. If you cover the same geography, you're serving the same market. And I'll take a moment and illustrate. And this is a carrier who's no longer in business, New England Motor Freight. But they operated very much in a head-to-head market from Chicago to the East Coast, same area that Pitt, Ohio operates in. When unfortunately they left the marketplace about maybe a year and a half ago, Pitt, Ohio was kind of surprised to find out that we really didn't pick up much market share from that. Well, we covered the same geography, but what was different? We serviced a different segment of consignees than New England Motor Freight did. They were more in a retail market, servicing appointment type deliveries. We're more in a next day high performance environment, staying away from appointment type deliveries. And that little story there really illustrates a clear difference between two carriers that serve the exact same market or serve the same geography, but ultimately service different consignee markets. Understanding what a shipper may ship to institutions, they may ship to big box retailers, they may be both in the same state, but the delivery requirements are different. And putting the right size shipment or using your TMS to put the right shipment with the right carrier will affect the right change. So at Pitt, Ohio, we're a next day carrier. We by and large stay away from appointment freight. There are other carriers out there who focus on appointment freight and move in and drop trailers there. Recently, I've had a conversation with one of our largest customers. Explained I needed a pretty significant rate increase. But I also explained that 2.5% of their shipments drove 10% of my delivery cost. If they could relocate 2.5% of the shipments to a carrier who was better suited to handle that business, my rate increase could be substantially less. And that's the change that we were able to affect. So it's really taking the information, managing it and acting upon it and collaborating together strategically to minimize the costing impact to both parties.
So I'm going to get myself in big trouble here. And, Gail does a great job of running NASSTRAC, and when we're talking about the strategic shipper initiative, but here's where I'm going to get myself in trouble. One of the attributes that we take a look at when companies are going to bid, and they ask for our experience, we've done billions of dollars worth of bids and all, is failing to address the carrier fitness factor. And that's what we're referring to. Take a look at how that carrier, where the bulk of their freight, like you said, you shy away from appointment freight. And you have other carriers that thrive on appointment freight, and that gives them preference, by the way, when they're going into Walmart. It gives them preference when they're going into the grocery products. Correct?
Correct.
So, I'm sorry.
Well, what I was going to say is, often over the years, I've heard you need to take the good with the bad. Okay. And that is one approach. It's an easier approach. And I think the key today in this environment to minimize cost increases for the carrier, but also for the shipper, is to take the information and act upon it and parse it out and provide the right shipment with the right carrier.
Okay, so but somebody asked this question here, and I want to bring it up to you. Are there certain product types that are easier to load or unload than others? So all other things being equal, with dynamic pricing impact, for example, fresh product like produce versus boxes of aspirin.
I tend to think of it more around stowability. In an LTL environment, it might be a little bit different in a truckload environment. But in an LTL environment, it's really this shipper's freight. How does it complement other business that I'm already handling on that truck? Can I maximize the payload? So I tend to think of it that way rather than around, when I hear freshness of product, maybe I'm hearing something around time sensitivity, right? In terms of it needing to be there very quickly.
Okay, there's another question from Matt, and he said historically shippers have cut their truckload freight into LTL shipments when capacity gets tight. What's the general approach to the larger LTL shipments, and what should shippers do to protect their LTL freight? Will LTL carriers commit to moving current partner freight?
Right.
Great question.
Okay. So
Anyone
I think the
else,
key
you
thing
can
is
use the Q&A. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I think the key thing to understand is, and we really haven't talked a little bit about the driver shortage, and COVID-19 and the rise in cases across the country right now is really exacerbating it. So what we have seen here, and Pitt has done a pretty remarkable job of keeping our drivers available for work, but even we are experiencing uptick in the number of drivers that are not available for work. So in this environment where drivers are scarce and it's not like you can go out and hire another one, they're not available. What you need to do is maximize the use of your equipment. And what we're looking to do is move as many LTL shipments as possible, smaller size shipments that maximizes our payload. Being asked to handle two 20,000-pound shipments on the same day is the exact opposite. So you're essentially asking the carrier to setting them up for failure. And you'll probably run into a lot of resistance, especially in an environment where you can't hire another driver or bring.
Well, and that's why some of the best carriers, Geoff, and I hate to step on top of you here, but some of the best carriers have used embargoes and flat out has said, we're not going to be picking up certain types of shipments because it's going to have too much of an impact on our network. That's kind of what you're referring to.
Right. It's just protecting service for the many rather than hurting it for the few. Something
you said in the last webinar that it comes back up in a question is, you mentioned Pitt, Ohio has 14,000 deliveries a day.
Yes.
If you are now delayed because of COVID-related issues where, for example, companies are furloughing or reducing their staff at their DCs, or because of COVID are restricting the number of trucks they'll take in at any given point in time, if you add 10 minutes a day, that's 140,000 minutes a day. Okay, correct?
Right. Correct.
The little Hulksters putting on my CPA hat, that's 2,300 hours a day. And I just want you to address this because you and I had this conversation. Typically, transportation and logistics can be what I call the garbage can for the manufacturers and distributors. They throw all their waste into the transportation logistics area and say, you handle it, you get it done, okay? Eric's point was now, you've got the data, you could reflect it in the operating ratio, and you now have the ability to help people understand that if you make my life more timely and costly, you're going to pay for it. Yes or no?
That's absolutely true. Or the flip side is if you can make me more efficient, I can either mitigate an increase, eliminate an increase, or potentially, if it's a really fundamental significant time saver, maybe even reduce your rate. And there are all ways to do that. It's the drop trailer pickup, full utilization of that trailer at time of pickup rather than picking up a quarter of a trailer. So there are a lot of different things from that standpoint. I think the key maybe takeaway, and I think Eric's kind of referencing this too in the truckload space, and the LTL, the small package guys have been there for probably a decade plus, is carriers understand their costs today to a level of minutia that they never did before. It's very granular, the information, and they're using it. And, to get your best price, you need to also use it as a shipper.
And that's where, just an example, when we get increases coming through, on the managing things through Freedom, one of the things we ask for, and the carriers, our Freedom partners, we've had them longstanding, they share operating ratio data. To your point, we had a carrier that was asking for a 39% increase. And what we found out, they had a change in their network because they lost a significant piece of business. They had us pull out 3 lanes, and that increase became 3%.
Right.
3 lanes out of 42. And that's why one of the things you can do as a shipper is assess the fitness factor, look at the operating ratio data. And one of the other things, Geoff, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to address this, the payment terms issue. Can you just address that?
Right. So, I think that our customers a lot of times some great ideas initiate from the finance department. They say there's a downturn in the market, take them out to bid. All of our vendors should be on 60-day payment terms, moving to 90-day payment terms. I could speak for Pitt, Ohio, but I would generalize this to the entire LTL industry. I imagine it also applies in truckload. At Pitt, Ohio, 80% of the costs that we incur are either incurred daily, which is the fuel we buy, or incurred weekly, which is the wages that we pay. Okay. So a service industry that employs a lot of people has a tremendous need for cash flow in a way that maybe a chemical manufacturer who's got a $30 million facility that they can write off over the next 30 years in terms of and it may have tremendous output of goods, but employs relatively few people. Well, their cash flow needs are going to look very different. And it's just understanding that service providers need cash coming in quickly because of their demands to pay their vendors and their employees.
So when you have a company that takes you out 90 days, you can reflect that in the operating ratio as an additional cost that's reflected in your rate structure.
It's not could, we would.
And Eric, the same thing on your end? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Now we're going to move into the parcel. There's not much there. Everything's calm and stable in the parcel market. And Jerry, if I had one question, I had a million. All the networks are full. What the heck can we do? So bring us home on the parcel side.
Well, when you think about it, there are not a lot of options because for the most part, the parcel industry is a duopoly. You know, it's FedEx and UPS, and they both mirror each other when they make strategic moves. Both of them are operating pretty much close to full right now. And the Tuesday after Thanksgiving is when they really get busy. So what's the biggest pinch point for them? Well, let's talk about the last mile. So what are the things that a shipper could do to approach FedEx and UPS to make their business more attractive? Both of them offer alternative pickup points for the package. So the pinch point being the amount of packages that go on a delivery driver's route. What if multiple packages could be dropped off at CVS or Walgreens? So one carrier has to deal with CVS, the other one has it with Walgreens, so that the delivery vehicles can drop off a lot of packages off their route at one time and get the customer to go pick it up. The same thing with what they call BOPIS, the buy online, pick up in the store. So if you're willing to work with the carriers to kind of change the buyer's behavior, that the last mile becomes part of the responsibility of the buyer, you'll be more attractive for the carriers. I just did a study this past week for a shipper, and it turned, because he's already had the visit from the carrier. Well, half this guy's business goes to 4 states. It goes to California, Texas, New York, and Florida. Well, is he willing to hold his freight for a day or two for those markets, cull it out, and move that stuff himself downstream and plug it into the networks some other place? Now, he may have his own facilities downstream, or I've already spoken to some 3PL companies that if you bring it to them, they can use their account number and ship it for you for a fee. So
Wait, back up, Jerry. Help people understand that, because you mentioned that on the pre-conference call, or the pre-webcast conference call, having a 3PL use their account number as opposed to your own. Why would you do that?
if you've been given a limit to how many packages you can tender FedEx or UPS in any given day, how do you deal with that? How do you decide which packages you're going to disappoint your customers with? And so you need to come up with a plan B. Plan B could be to call out New York, California, Florida, and Texas, put them on a trailer yourself, move them downstream, plug them into a 3PL, have them put their account number label on it and get it delivered for a fee to the consumer. Now, they're also in this gig market that I had a delivery to my house today from somebody in a car. They were a gig worker. And so they're working out of a central place and they're bidding on deliveries going into a central place. So there's ways to work around this. None of them are pretty. And pretty is not going to come back maybe for a long time. Certainly January and February, traditionally the volume will fall off. But as you know, since COVID began back in February, buying behavior has changed. And when we're done with COVID, when the vaccine is out there, is the buying behavior now going to revert back to what it was before? I don't think so. Yes, some corporations are going to have their people start to migrate back to the office and some of the buying behavior will change. But I got a feeling that by April of next year or May, we're going to be back up to the Christmas level of packages and we'll build from there. Now, you touched on the vaccine before. We've got 2 vaccines that may affect the industry, and my personal opinion, not so much truckload and less than truckload, even though we're talking about vast quantities of vaccine. The vaccines have to be, the Pfizer one has to be kept at 70 or below, 0. The Moderna one has to be 20 or below. So 20 below means a regular freezer can store it at Walgreens and CVS. 70 below, it's going to have to go to be delivered to very specific places like hospitals that have invested in freezers that can handle 70 below. I know in the case of Pfizer, they've already lined up FedEx, UPS, and DHL to handle the shipments coming out of Kalamazoo. They've cut out all of the other touch points in this. And so they're all ready to go. The logistics is there. They're ready to go. As soon as approval happens, Pfizer's already been manufacturing the vaccine. I assume Moderna has also been manufacturing the vaccine. They too have according to their numbers, a more efficacious vaccine. So this stuff is going to be moving through transportation networks, but most likely they're going to be small shipments packed in dry ice, and they're going to be moved by a FedEx, UPS, DHL, and they're going to move on airplanes because of they're perishable to their destinations, and then they'll go on delivery vehicles and get a first stop delivery for the drivers. So there may be some delays in the routes as they get rid of the dry ice shipments, but know that that's coming, and it may come in the middle of the period between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Now, the other thing you asked me to touch on was all of these rates upon rates that we're seeing announced and already in effect. Even the Postal Service has a peak surcharge. The biggest one I think that you mentioned, Mike, was this new 105-inch length and girth rule. And so if people are not keeping the data on their shipments, a history, or using a company like TranzAct, they may be in for a big surprise come the end of January when they find out their shipping budgets have gone way out of whack. This particular shipper that I'm working with this week, I looked at their file. They have hundreds and hundreds of shipments that don't qualify now for this new fee, this $16 fee, that are going to qualify for it after the first of the year. And they're in for a big bill unless they take action now. Now, as you said, Jerry's first mantra is everything's negotiable. Number 2, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. And so it's up to you as a shipper. Does the effective date have to be what they say, or can you push the effective date out till later next year? Does it have to be 105 cubic inches in length and girth? Could it be 130, 180, 200? Does it have to be $16, or could it be 8 or 4? So everything on a piece of paper is negotiable.
Okay, but Jerry, let me interrupt. Let me interrupt for a moment, because I think you have an issue with a lot of shippers not knowing how many packages are going to get not qualified, but get assessed. And for those of you who are wondering, how do you calculate girth? It is the length of the shipment plus 2 times the height and width of the shipment.
And 2 times the width, right?
And so, you know, and this is also for Geoff, and I would say for Eric. You know, one of our interviews, our good friend Darren Hawkins from YRC, now Yellow, the CEO, mentioned something on a previous webcast that we did with CSCMP and NASSTRAC, that, you know, right now today that the carriers can measure time in seconds, and they can measure, you know, space in inches. So, you know, the challenge that I have that, you know, Geoff, a lot of people don't know the size of the shipment that they're putting on your truck. You know, how do you educate shippers in, you know, and Eric, you know, the time factor? You know, how do you educate, what can the shippers take away from this call? The one thing they could do tomorrow to push for that would make a significant impact in their ability to work with you?
Mike, I would throw out is engaging with your point of contact, your sales rep at the respective carrier to understand what are the cost drivers associated with my account. Don't wait for the rate increase to have a conversation to come around to have that conversation. Get involved in having that conversation today and start working on that, because typically it's not something that you can affect the change with. If you decide to take action and your company moves, it's probably going to take a little bit of time convince other departments, other aspects of your company to make those changes. And what you really want to do is build up a demonstrated record of improvement, at which point you're in a very strong position to mitigate that rate increase. So
Okay.
It's never too early to start asking, what are the cost drivers associated with my account?
Cost drivers. Okay, we do have a couple of questions and I want to wrap it up and be respectful of time. Jerry, an observation from our friend Bob in St. Louis. DHL is wrapping up domestic U.S. business-to-business air services. Is that something that will be positive?
I don't understand the question. I mean, DHL here in the United States is not a domestic carrier except for their division called DHL e-commerce. And I don't know.
Okay.
DHL e-commerce, unfortunately, like FedEx and UPS, they're full. They're not taking any new customers right now. But the more competition we have, the better it is for shippers.
Good enough. The other thing for this, just as an observation, and Avery, I don't know if you're familiar with this, according to IWLA, no one has minus 70-degree warehouse space available. Minus 40 is the limit. Most food warehouses have minus 20. That being the case, how does the virus get delivered?
This stuff isn't going to get warehoused anywhere. This is going to go right from the manufacturer to the point of delivery in coolers that have dry ice.
Okay.
There's not going to be time for this stuff to sit around. Otherwise, they're going to be throwing away tons of vaccine.
Another question. Do 3PLs get better pricing, Geoff, because of sophisticated holistic approach, or are they viewed as hunting carrier margin? That's a great question.
We offer the same price. So we analyze the cost characteristics to handle an account directly or through a 3PL. And we'll offer the same price to that 3PL if they would want to mark it up, or we would do it direct through the shipper. So I would say there's very little economy of scale. I think the bigger opportunity working with a 3PL for a shipper is the information that they can access collectively and harness to make their entire supply chain more efficient.
We call it increasing the fit factor. We can help increasing the fit factor.
There you go with that.
Pick the right carrier selection, right. That's better. There is one question that was asked. And this
if I could just finish it off the thought, sure. I think 10 years ago, the idea that a 3PL had a lot of volume and that could drive a better price possibly worked, but that train has left the station.
Okay, and I agree with you there. We have a question here, and this is from Andrew, and I'll answer this myself. He's got a question that basically deals with interline shipments. And his question basically, how do we challenge the tendered carrier or tender the next LTL load to the true LTL freight line? I would just suggest to you there that you need to understand the carrier service capabilities. Interline moves are where you give it to one carrier, picks it up, another carrier delivers it. That's a reality of life, tends to be among the smaller providers, but some of the larger ones are doing it when they have out-of-network shipments where they can minimize the cost. Is that an accurate assessment, Geoff?
I think it is. Again, it's understanding each carrier's network. At Pitt, Ohio, we own a number of sister companies, and we treat that as direct business. But there might another carrier working with another company that's not a sister company might look at it differently. So it's having a more nuanced conversation with your service provider about what is their area of strength and not.
And you need to understand, and there are things like in our TMS where we can identify if in fact it's going to be an interline move. The other thing, Jerry, once again, Bob from St. Louis was active, and he mentioned the pushback from UPS and FedEx for zone skipping as a contingency for ground planning.
Everybody works with a sales rep who's compensated for his performance. Everything's negotiable. You just gotta,
okay.
You just have to put a sense of urgency in the gut of the sales rep that's calling on you.
Okay, so we basically rule 2 in the Jerry Hempstead is you get what you negotiate. Listen, folks, we could go on and on. We have reached our time limit. Gail's going to fire me if I don't get this all wrapped up, but I cannot thank you enough. Just some key takeaways, and round robin, up or down, thumbs up, thumbs down. Basically, pay attention to your docs. Make those as efficient as possible and know what's going on at your supplier's docks as well as your customers' docks. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Avery, we're taking a look at this lasting into 2021 and quite possibly into 2022. Thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yes.
Okay. Number 3 there is how you treat the driver and your driver facilities available for the driver, critically important. And yes, thumbs up, thumbs down. We're taking a look at speed and velocity and take a look at the carrier fitness factor, how it fits into the carrier's network and impacts their speed and velocity. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay, Jerry's thumb isn't working. Jerry, is it, this type of thing? And then the other thing I want, I'm not going to, go ahead, Jerry.
The key for the shippers that are listening is in the data. That you can get the data from your carriers. They have every iota of information about the history of your shipments for the last couple of years. Ask them for it, and know your business when you enter into negotiations with the carriers. They know more about your business than you do.
Well, good enough. For the person that asked the question about the LTL rate increases, we covered that in the last one. We'll be able to give you the slides. Geoff, we said somewhere in the area of 4 to 6% on the LTL side, generally speaking. And the issue of spotted trailers, Eric, I think you guys have no problem with spotted trailers, provided you get them back. I was talking with one carrier that was telling me Walmart was complaining about their delivery into their network, and the carrier CEO said to Walmart, if you'll give us back the 400 trailers that you're in possession of, it'll help us get the freight delivered. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, listen, we have some other things that we could go over, but the carrier collaboration, we have some documents for you. If you're interested in the yield test, these individuals, Geoff, I think you've reviewed it. Jerry, you've seen it. We'd be happy to share that with you, as well as things that you can do. We'll make a webcast of replay available. And I can't thank you enough. I've just been drinking from the fire hose hydrant here. So thank you very much, Gail. We also, maybe you could talk about one thing you could do is NASSTRAC. If you'll go to NASSTRAC, it's free of charge. We launched, and Gail did this with some members of NASSTRAC. It's a great organization, a strategic shipper initiative where we brought in the carriers. So Gail, maybe you can wrap that up, bring people information and bring us home. Okay?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, if you're interested in the strategic shipper program, you can go to NASSTRAC.org, and right across the banner, you'll click on Become a Strategic Shipper. There's a code of conduct that was put together by the members of NASSTRAC. And it's symbolic in a way, but it also shows the carriers that the shippers are at least making the attempt to try and improve their processes and procedures. And there's some information about there to help you trap some of that data at your dock. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at info@nasstrac.org. And thank you for your time today.